Can we please resume the assembly? Can we please invite everyone to sit down?
May I invite everybody just to take a seat, please?
Gradually get.
Yes. I'm not going to sing like Edmund did because I forgot to switch off his phone this morning for the prayer. You know, May I invite this group here on the left-hand side just to take their seats, please. Oh, yes, yes, please. Sorry. Switch. Perhaps we can start now with our last part of the morning session. So first of all, welcome back after the group sessions here to our last plenary session this morning. And I would like at the beginning of this last session this morning to welcome two people who we will hear in the coming days, tomorrow and after. One is Almaya van Castel, she will speak to us tomorrow. And also welcome to Philipp Geisler. He also will talk to us, so both have arrived just now, and a very warm welcome to both of them. The second element is on behalf of the organization to all those who have been in the working groups in the -1, sincere apologies for the confusion, and we will learn from that. And the third is that somebody forgot his mobile phone. It has brought to us, please, in the corridor of the first, yeah. So it's here, just to pick it up. And then I would like to ask Adriana if you could present to us our last speaker of this morning.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for resuming our session. I was also invited to invite everyone in the auditorium to try to start on time in the small groups, in the working groups, etc., in the workshops, because we need to stick to the agenda. So, although we understand that everyone, of course, has to answer messages, emails, and deal with other issues, let's try to at least keep up with the time. So it is my pleasure to, in fact, introduce our concluding seminar. And we have a very welcome speaker with us who is connected from the United States. He's been patiently waiting for us, so twice as much thank you. Gaël Giraud, who will be talking about integral ecology in the Anthropocene. Gaël Giraud has an impressive academic background. He got his PhD in applied mathematics at the École Polytechnique, and he is still currently a senior researcher at the Center for National Research in Economics, has got many publications. Since 2004, he joined the Society of Jesus. Since 2017, he has been a permanent fellow at the Nantes Institute for Advanced Studies, and since 2018, he's an invited professor at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. Since 2020, he holds a second PhD in theology and has been appointed as a research professor at Georgetown University, where he also founded the Georgetown Environmental Justice Program. So we are honored to have Gaël with us. Gaël, now the floor is yours. You have about 25 minutes to give your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, muchas gracias. Buenos días a todos. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be with you. I'm sorry not to be with you in person, but since I work in the US, I try to reduce my carbon footprint and therefore not to take the plane. So I'm going to share my screen with you. I hope you can see it, and you can also hear me, so it should work. Simply lethal for the human body. Also not for Giraud, who is with you today because he's very strong, but for a normal human being, he will not survive if he or she is exposed more than 6 hours, let's say to a combination of temperature like 40 degrees Celsius, and at the same time 20-25% of humidity. So if you have something then like this, or more humidity or more heat, then you simply die. So this is the curve of different combinations of heat and humidity. So this is a clinical experiment, we know that, and the question is, will there be peaks of heat and humidity on Earth that essentially every day, every year, people will be exposed to different combinations of heat and humidity? If it's light yellow, it means approximately 1 day over 3, every 3rd day, okay? So what you can see here is that the vast majority of the Amazon basin will be just uninhabitable. Also, a great part of Central America. The southeastern coast of the US will be yellow, which means 1 day over 3, which means people will have to migrate to the north. So there will be huge migrations inside the US. A significant part of the Union Gulf will be also touched. Also, of course, and that's new for a number of people, the Arabic Peninsula here, and of course, the Indian subcontinent. And even very deep inside the continent, people will be exposed to little combinations of heat and humidity, which means, hundreds of millions of people will have to move. And as you see here, the vast majority of Southeast Asia, with one very problematic country, which is Indonesia. Here is the Java Island, which will be exposed to this. And one question is, where are the poor going to move? Rich people, they don't have any difficulty in moving, migrating, but as we see now in Ukraine, that the question is for poor people. And I will ask the question to you today, what do you think about poor people in Indonesia? Where are they going to migrate? Do you really believe that they will be hosted, let's say, in Australia? I'm very skeptical. Or that they will go to, let's say, the backyard of China, like Vietnam, Malaysia, etc. That's a big geopolitical question. And if you look at China now, again here, like for the US, you have yellow and even orange parts of the eastern coast, which means that there will be presumably also huge migrations inside China. So then the main question for us and for every one of us, I guess, is to try to avoid this catastrophe and to take into account what we're observing today with Ukraine is just the beginning of the preface of, the introduction of much bigger problems of climate refugees. Another point is and here, the main suspects are completely different. Now Europe is touched. Europe was not concerned here because there's not enough humidity in Europe. But now with the lack of drinkable water, if you think of Spain, look at Spain. Spain now lose between 40 and 80% of its access to drinkable water. When by 2040, not at the end of the century, but 2040, that is the day after tomorrow. Look, of course, at Asia here, the Arabic Peninsula again, Indonesia again, now also the southern part of Africa, the US will be concerned by the lack of drinkable water. This is due to the fact that the water cycle is completely perturbed by by global warming. The next point is, as you probably know already, is the growing scarcity of a number of minerals. So I have published a number of papers which suggest that copper might be a very scarce resource in the coming decades. We might reach the peak of extraction of copper at the world level before 2060. And as you probably know, copper is universally used by everybody in industry. Not just for electricity, but everywhere. So we have a few decades now to find substitutes to copper, and above all, to try to recycle copper. And this is not just true for copper, but for a number of other minerals. So this is a map which has been drawn by the European Commission, which suggests that, China has a lot of metals. Look at this list here. Europe is very poor. Africa has a significant number of minerals, especially look at South Africa here. And the American continent is somewhere in between. And so there is also a geopolitical challenge linked to minerals and the fact that China has invented its grandiose plan of the Silk Belt Road is not just a way to make business with us, it's also a way to extract minerals everywhere on Earth where it's interesting to do it. And one remark, for instance, one side remark is that there is a Silk Belt Road which goes across Ukraine, which links Moscow to Istanbul. And my guess is that China was and still is very interested in extracting the minerals in Ukraine, which are very, very abundant. The next point is biomass. So as you understand, my viewpoint is that there will be a nexus which will be very important for us and for everybody, especially for poor people in the coming decades, which is access to energy, renewable energies, access to water, access to minerals, and now access to biomass. Why? Because without biomass, we just cannot survive. And here you have a map which has been drawn by a friend of mine working for NASA, Mark Imhoff, which describes what he calls the HANPP here, human appropriation of net primary production, which is the deficit between the quantity of biomass consumed by people and the quantity of biomass produced by local ecosystems. So as you see here, for instance, in India, again, you have a lot of yellow and red points, which means that people are consuming much more biomass than they are producing locally. Same story for China here, China and South Korea, a little bit of Japan, again for the Java Island in Indonesia, for the Arabic Peninsula here, something not completely relevant in Northern Europe and East and Central Europe here, and a little bit in the north of the US. What does it mean? It means that all these people, they rely on international value chains in order to have biomass. But we have seen during the pandemic that international value chains might be just interrupted, and some of them still did not recover today, and therefore they are very fragile, and therefore we have to think about another way to ensure food security for a number of people. So I'm just stressing Africa because when I was working as a chief economist of the French Development Bank, one thing was clear for us, which is the fact that we cannot ensure food security in Africa for the next 25 years. And I'm not sure that everybody has understood that. So sometimes when we speak about this question, there are people who say, well, we know it's serious, but the human being is so clever, we will find a way to escape from the catastrophe. And my answer to that is, well, I hope so, but it's not clear because we already had catastrophes. So I just recommend you to read this frightening and beautiful book written by Mike Davis, who is an American historian, late Victorian Holocaust. What he found is that in 1893, at the end of the 19th century, there was a big El Nino effect on the Pacific Ocean, which led to huge floods and droughts at the same time, both in Brazil, in Africa, in India, and in China. But at this time, all these countries were colonies, and the colonial administration just neglected completely the problem. And the consequence of this was that there were something like 50 million dead within a few years. So this is just gigantic. And the disturbing point is that we have completely forgotten this aspect. So it's as important as the First World War, I believe. And Mike Davis also was astonished to discover this. And so it shows that we already had big catastrophes. We know that El Nino effects will just be more severe in the future because of global warming. And therefore, the main question for me is, how are we going to succeed in avoiding a replication of this kind of trauma and catastrophe? I'm sure most of us are completely frustrated by the fact that we talk about this question for years now, and for some of us for decades, and nothing much is happening. So this is the main topic of the very interesting and nice movie, Don't Look Up. I can just recommend you to watch this movie. I was fascinated by this movie, and honestly, I felt really, some of us are really in the position of Leonardo DiCaprio in this movie for years already. The question is, why aren't we moving more than that? And this is where I want to enter into a discussion with you about our unconscious anthropology, which I believe is questioned by Pope Francis. And most of these big texts, Laudato Si, Fratelli Tutti, but also Querida Amazonia, and now what he tries to do with synodality in the church. If you look at this picture, which is very well known, in Italian, it's L'Uomo di Vitruvio, di Leonardo da Vinci. So some people believe that this might be the hallmark of humanity. But if you believe this, look twice. This means that humanity is what? It's a man, no woman. So it's a male, a white male. Other, ethnies are not represented. He's completely alone in a kind of metaphysical solitude. He's not connected to nature. Nature is completely absent. There are no children, there are no elderly, and there are no sick people. So it's a white male in good shape, completely alone, facing the world with what? With just geometry, which means science and technology. And while, there are a number of anthropologists who say that since the 17th century in Europe, we are obsessed by this kind of anthropology, implicit anthropology. We believe that human being can be represented by this. And I think that what Laudato Si is doing, and also Fratelli Tutti, is just to remind us, that this is not true, and that this is certainly not a Christian anthropology. So a Christian anthropology is much more a relational anthropology, whereas the Pope says in Laudato Si, when we speak of the environment, what we really mean is a relationship existing between nature and the society which lives in it. It cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. We are part of nature, included in it, and thus in constant interaction with it. And it's very surprising to observe that there are a number of people who already, for centuries, have this kind of anthropology. For instance, in Zimbabwe, in the Shona language, people speak about what they call ukama, and ukama for them is just the fact that a human being is someone who is related to nature intrinsically, but who is also related to the past, thanks to the ancestors, and who is also related to the future, thanks to what the ancestors are telling him, for instance, during his dreams about the future. And therefore, for people in Zimbabwe, they would say, a human being who believes in this anthropology is not a human being. A human being is someone who is related to everything. So the relationship is much more central for these people than it is for us Westerners. Then the consequence of this is that having abandoned for almost 4 centuries this kind of relational anthropology, which is at the heart of the Bible, I believe, we have made a number of mistakes, and this is what Laudato Si also denounces. So I just want to read again for you the number 123, which I believe is very important. The same kind of thinking, says the Pope, leads to the sexual exploitation of children and abandonment of the elderly who no longer serve our interests. It is also the mindset of those who say, let us allow the invisible forces of the market regulate the economy and consider the impact on society and nature as collateral damage. And as you know, in the first chapter of Fratelli Tutti, the Pope is also denouncing again this kind of market optimism or market fundamentalism, which enables a number of people to believe that they don't have to care about ecology, they don't have to care about poor people, about children, about elderly, about women, just because, you know, the market will solve every question. In September 2020, I had an audience with the Pope, and we discussed about this quote from Laudato Si, and the Pope added a fourth item. So not just children, elderly, and we would also say for sure poor people, but also women. So he said there is also an intrinsic link between, you know, the neglect and abandonment of women by, let's say, alpha males and ecological destruction. Very often, these are the same people who are doing both. So, and I believe this is intrinsically linked to this. That is, if we believe in this kind of anthropology, why should this white male take care of women? You know, they don't matter. So on the side of economics, one way to try to understand this, let's say, relational anthropology is to embed economics within thermodynamics. I'm not going to enter into the details. We are working on this with some of my researchers in Georgetown. It's a vast research program, and then instead of, you know, plunging into the details of this, which are quite technical, I want to spend a few minutes also with you answering a question which is often raised to us, Christians, by people who accuse us for being responsible for this ecological disaster. Why? Well, they say, you know, in the first book of the Bible, the Genesis, chapter 1, verse 28, you can read the following. Then God blessed them, Adam and Eve, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, etc., etc. And the main question is, what does this dominion mean? And many people would accuse us, Christians, and people who live according to the Bible, of being responsible for the ecological disaster. Why? Because we would be defenders of this violent interpretation of what dominion means. But then the question is, what does dominion mean according to the Bible? And for that purpose, we Christians, we have to look at Christ, who teaches us and tells us what he understands as being dominion. And it's certainly not a violent, dominion and power as embodied in this guy here. You see the contrast between this guy and Christ here. So, and of course, we should acknowledge that within our Christian traditions, there are a number of ambiguities. That is, we know this already in the gospel when Christ enters Jerusalem. He doesn't enter on a horse, as you know. So he doesn't enter as a triumphant king, but there are a number of people who believe that he will restore the kingdom of David and be a powerful king. And this kind of misunderstanding goes on even after Christ's death and resurrection. If you look at the book of the Acts of the Apostles, you remember that just before the ascension, the disciples asked him a question. Lord, is it at this time you are restoring the kingdom of Israel? So they still wait for him to be a powerful monarch, as you know, Jewish messianism would expect him to be as a Messiah, you know. And I'm certain you remember the answer. The answer is, it is not for you to know times or epochs which the Father has fixed by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you shall be my witnesses, both in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and even to the remotest part of the earth. In other words, Christ refuses to be this powerful monarch, and he refuses to be this completely alone, powerful and violent white male. So which means that we have to re-understand what dominion here means. We cannot just assume that dominion has the classical meaning that we would give to it, you know, after Thomas Hobbes, after John Locke, etc., etc. Dominion has its own significance inside the Bible. And maybe one way to understand it, I will jump this and go back to it if you want me to do it, but I will jump to the end. If you look now at the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, chapter 3, verse 20-22, there is this absolutely astonishing sentence. So God is speaking and say, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in to him and will dine with him and he with me. He who overcomes the great, you know, the great struggle of holiness. He who overcomes, I will grant to him to sit down with me on my throne, as I also overcame and sat down with my Father on his throne. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. In other words, the perspective that is offered to us by the book of Revelation is that God wants to share his power with us. Why? Because he wants us to sit on his throne with him. And then the big question for us is, holiness probably means that we have to learn how to accept that. We have to learn no longer to be the servant of God, as in John 15:15, as you know, but to be someone who is welcomed by God in such a way that he and she can sit on the throne with him, which is a complete, reversal of perspective. In other words, dominion, according to the Bible, is a commons that God wants to share with us. And the question for us is, are we ready to share it with creation, with the earth, with plants, with animals? One way to understand it is to go in the direction of the golden rule in the gospel. As you know, in Matthew, the golden rule says, do to others what you want them to do to you. This is the meaning of the law of Moses and the teaching of the prophets. And you probably know, there are a number of people, big philosophers, who have worked on the golden rule. So Leibniz, Kant, but also a German and French theologian, Christophe Theobald, who is putting a lot of emphasis on this, saying, the golden rule actually is the background of every Christian ethics and spirituality. Why? Because the golden rule asks you basically to make this spiritual experience, which is to take the place of the other without leaving your own place. So the question is not to become schizophrenic, but to make the experience that the other might have a different viewpoint than mine, that my viewpoint is only one viewpoint among many others, and that I may try to take the place of the others in order to understand them, to understand their viewpoint. And I believe synodality is nothing else, is the collective experience that we have to try to take the place of the others in order to try to understand the others. So here you have from Wikipedia the list of religions and spiritual traditions which emphasize the golden rule. So the golden rule is a kind of universal anthropological law, if you want. And here you have an allusion to this beautiful theater piece by Gottlob Lessing, a German philosopher from the 18th century, which is called Nathan der Weise in German, Nathan the Wise in English, which tells the following parable. There was one day a king who died, and he had 3 sons. So the 3 sons gather, and the elderly son says, well, he gave me the ring of power, so now I'm the successor of our father. But the second son says, no, you're a liar. He gave me the ring, and the second son shows a second ring. He gave me the ring, and therefore I'm the legitimate successor. And the third son says, well, you are both liars because he gave to me the ring, and I am the legitimate successor. So the 3 of them are competing for the legitimate succession of the father. And then the prophet Nathan enters the picture and says, well, we don't know who is really the true successor of your father, but we will see it through history according to your ethical behavior. So when Lessing wrote this theater piece in the 18th century in Europe, in Germany, or what would be called Germany later on, he had in mind the 3 monotheistic religions, so Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And he was saying, we don't know who is the legitimate successor of Abraham, but we will see it through your ethical behavior. And I would add to this, probably through the way we put into practice in our daily life the golden rule. And I will finish this for the Q&A. So just 2 simple applications of that. The first one is an echo of what Sabine Bieri said this morning. That is, you remember, she emphasized the fact that finance and economy play a big role in the problem. And I would say, it seems to me the main obstacles of the ecological transition is the funding of the green investments. So there is a French think tank of which I'm the president, which is called the Rousseau Institute, which published 2 weeks ago a report on the cost of the ecological transition in France. And the answer is 2% of the French GDP every year. That's the additional cost in order to green infrastructures in France and to have some chance to fulfill the promise that we made to be carbon neutral by 2050. Then you might ask a question, where are we going to find this 2%, approximately 50 billion euros every year? And the answer is the banking system could fund that easily. But the banking system is not doing it. Why? Because of another problem that we highlighted last year in another report, which is that many banks in Europe, but it's the same in the US, many banks have a lot of fossil assets on the balance sheet. What does it mean? They have assets, financial assets, which are directly linked either to coal or to oil or to gas. And if these three fossil fuels are stranded assets tomorrow morning, so if we are serious and we say we ban both coal, oil, and gas, then most of these banks will be bankrupt. What we found last year is that if you look just at the first 11 banks in Europe, then they have more than 530 billion euros of fossil assets, which represent on average 95% of their equity. In other words, if these assets, if the market value of these assets shrink to zero, then they are bankrupt because they are going to lose the most part of their equity, and they know it. Therefore, officially they are converted to the ecological transition, but in the corridor, they are doing everything possible in order to prevent this from happening. Why? Because they know they're going to die. So we need to take their place to understand our problems. So this is an application of the golden rule, and to ask ourselves, what can we do to save our banks from this trap and from this dead end? Another application is when we talk to people in Amazonia, and I will be very short, you know that Pope Francis is emphasizing this and saying constantly that we have to learn how to talk with indigenous people in the Amazon in order for them to teach us how to deal with nature. And it seems to me, with this respect, what we have to learn from indigenous people is not just a relational anthropology, as I said earlier, but even a relational cosmology. So there is a beautiful work written by a French anthropologist whose name is Philippe Descola, who described 4 cosmologies. So the Western cosmology, naturalism, is here, and it's very simple. It's what everybody has in mind, I guess, in the room, which is that we believe that we are similar to, let's say, a tree or a natural ecosystem in physicality, but we have something that he calls interiority, that we could call a soul or a spirit, which makes us completely different from, let's say, a snake or a jaguar. But there are people, especially in the Amazon, who believe completely differently, that either, if they are animist, that we share both similarity in interiority with, let's say, a pond or a hill, but we are dissimilar physically. There are totemist people who believe that, for instance, there is a totem in the jungle, let's say a puma, and if I kill this puma, I will kill myself because we are both similar in physicality and interiority with this puma. And there are people, and that's the analogist cosmology, who believe we are dissimilar both in interiority and in physicality, and we are linked to each other thanks to analogical relationships. And the analogist cosmology was essentially the cosmology prevailing in Europe, Christian Europe, before the 17th century. And so the question raised by Philippe Descola is, are we ready to understand people who have a completely different cosmology, to talk to them and to let them teach us the way they view the world? So one simple way to do this exercise is offered to us by a beautiful book by a Brazilian anthropologist, Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, in his book Metaphysica Canibais, where he says something which I think echoes what Javier Arellano said to you this morning, which is that poor people have to teach us the way, the path towards transformation. So what Eduardo Viveiros de Castro shows in the follow-up of Descola's 4 cosmologies is that, for a number of people in the Amazon, well, human beings, we tend to see the world as follows. So there are a number of preys for us, pecaries, beautiful birds, maybe some monkeys, but there are also very dangerous animals like the jaguar here. But now the jaguar himself has a completely different viewpoint. He views some prey similar to ours, Maybe he's also sensitive to the beauty of some beautiful birds. Maybe he also wants to eat some monkeys, but he also have, he likes eating some small boys from time to time because they are so delicious. So the jaguar has a completely different viewpoint, which actually is similar to us, except that he believes that he's a human being and that we are either a prey or a competitor. Then a question raised by these people and in some indigenous people in the Amazon is, who is a human being? So you would say, well, it's obvious, we. Well, I would answer to that, it's not that obvious. Think of the fact that many of us who believe in this anthropology here, for instance, keep eating meat. And I'm sure you're aware of the fact that meat has a carbon footprint which is much higher than every vegetable protein that we could eat instead of meat. And well, for instance, personally, I'm vegetarian for 5 years now, and I would be happy to ask a question in the room: who is vegetarian in the room? And we know that we are eating too much meat. It's not good for our health. And we also know that adults between, let's say, 20 and 65 don't need to eat animal proteins. Vegetable proteins are far sufficient. And I will stop here. There is an interesting quote also in the Bible just after Genesis 1:28. You remember what I quote here about this ambivalent dominion? Just after that, what we read is the following. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it, they will be used for food. In other words, if we take a literal interpretation of this, and I'm not saying we should do so, then the Bible is just advising us to be also vegetarian. So this is a kind of joke. It's a half joke, let's say. But I just want to go back to this question: who is human being? Who is a human here? Look at what we're doing in Ukraine. Look at the difficulty we have just to give up eating meat. This shows that it's far from being obvious, and that I believe that indigenous people in the Amazon have a good point when they ask us the question: who is really human in the jungle? And I will stop here.
Thank you, Gaël, for your wonderful speech and the many aspects you have shown us, be it scientific in one way, theological in the other one, and bringing them together and make us think about it. I'm looking at the time, and I would open up the floor for maximum of 3 questions. 3 questions to Gaël. So may I just ask who has a question? I see one, yeah.